Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're watching from. Thank you so very much for joining this Internet Lab Exchange sort of mini conference about the fair share debate that is taking place currently both in Europe, but it's also happening across the world. My name is Konstantinos Komaitis. I am a non-resident fellow with the Lisbon Council and a senior researcher. And I have been following this conversation quite closely. And I'm very, very happy to be here to talk to some really pretty awesome people about their experience with the debate and their perspectives on it. So let's put things a little bit in context before I go to introduce our panelists. It was around, I believe, March 2022 when there was a joint letter by the CEOs of some of the largest telecommunications companies, including Deutsche Telekom, Vodafone, Orange, and Telefonica, that they reintroduced the idea of how to deal with the increasing infrastructure costs. And part of this idea was that certain technology companies that, according to what they were saying, they generate a lot of traffic, and we will discuss this statement, of course, as we go along, should pay for those infrastructure costs. Soon after that letter, the Commissioner for the Internal Market, Thierry Breton, sort of confirmed that the Commission is looking indeed in some sort of a framework that would allow this transfer to happen. And he confirmed this in an interview in a French newspaper. And that was around about May 2022. So here we are, a year and a half later, and we're still talking about it. The European Commission launched a consultation in February of 2023, and the results are not out yet. We were hoping that the results would be out by the time we're having this conversation, so we could actually talk about how the public and stakeholders perceive this. But one of the things about this whole conversation, and I'm sure that some of our panelists will also allude to this, is that it is not particularly new. Back in 2012, ETNO, which is the European Telecommunications Network Association, put forward a proposal that looked and read very similar to this one. And the proposal was put forward before the International Telecommunications Union World Conference on International Telecommunications, WICIT, in 2012. It was rejected. Between 2012 and 2023 that we have now, a lot of network neutrality laws were passed, including in Europe. We had the 2015 Open Internet Regulation, which affirmed the concept of network neutrality. But the fact that this proposal keeps coming back means that, however, indicates, better yet, that it means something. And I think that this is why we're here, in order to try to figure out what exactly that means. Today we will be having two panels. They're not really, well, they're separate, but they're also sort of consequential with one another. And let me go and introduce each one of them. So in panel one, we will have Marco Schialdone, who is the head of litigation and academic outreach at Euroconsumers. Hi, Marco. We will also have Caroline de Kock, who is a communications expert and who has spent a lot of time speaking to a lot of different people, both in Europe and outside of Europe, about this fair share conversation, including myself. Hi, Caroline. And we also have Carl Ganberg, who is a director for policy development and research at the Internet Society. Hi, Carl. In the second panel, we have Smitri Parshira. I hope I said that correctly, Smitri, who is a fellow at CyberBRICS project. We have Kyung Sing Park, a law professor at Korea's university, and someone who has been following this conversation in South Korea for quite some time, And of course, KS, I'll come back to you and you will tell us about South Korea, because literally it's the only jurisdiction that sort of provides us with some indication of how things might go should the fair share proposal go through. And last but certainly not least, Professor Luca Belli. He is a professor at FGV Law School and the director of the CyberBRICS project, amongst many other things that I'm not going to list here. Welcome, everyone. It's great to have all of you. I know that some of you are either staying up way too late or waking up way too early because of your time zones. I really appreciate this. So let's start. First of all, Caroline, I will go to you. And my question, I guess, to you would be, as I said in the beginning, this has now been a year and a half, at least, of a conversation in Europe. And you have spoken to a lot of people, both in Europe and outside of Europe, academics and various experts and, people working in the industry and so on. What do you think we have learned after a year and a half of this conversation?
Thank you, Konstantinos. As you mentioned, this has been ongoing for a year and a half, approximately. I've done about 30 podcasts on the topic with infrastructure experts, academics, civil society representatives, regulators, policymakers. We've also, for those people that haven't spotted it, we've kept track on our Internet Lab resources page of all the publicly available positions on this topic, both in a very extensive spreadsheet and in 2 summary infographics. And the amazing picture that this has painted is one of nearly unique cohesion in terms of position. Namely, on the one hand, you have the small club of telcos, telecommunications operators, that stand to benefit from a fair share measure. They are all obviously in favor. And on the other, everyone else is against. That's pretty much where you stand at this stage. And if you know the Brussels bubble, the Brussels policy space, getting civil society, consumer organizations, academia, big tech, and the creative sector, I mean, basically Hollywood, to agree on anything in Brussels, that's something that does not happen often these days. So all of these people agreeing, there must be something wrong with the idea. So let's look at the debate and how people have translated it to me to a certain extent. So it's about fairness. And fairness is an absolutely legitimate criteria in some legislative discussions. I mean, it's been used as a threshold, for example, in the DMA discussions, and that's fine because there was a definition and there was a point to using that expression. But in recent years, from my experience in Brussels, fairness has become the umbrella under which policymakers are encouraged to brush up their knights in shining armor complex and to basically intervene in matters where objectively there's no real reason to do so. So it's a free pass to adopt subjective rules. So the discussion you get to when you see exchanges, on LinkedIn, on Twitter, X, don't know how you call it these days, social media, when you see exchanges between the different factions, what you see is experts that state there's no reason to intervene as everything functions as it should. And then the vested interest replies, yes, but it's so unfair. So that is not the most argumented discussion, but I guess it appeals to emotions to a certain extent.
If I just may interject here a little bit. So, I suspect that what you're trying to say is that, a lot of the stakeholders, whether they're the creative industry or the big tech or smaller businesses or infrastructure providers, are using arguments, right, to explain why this proposal is perhaps problematic. Whereas, and the response that and the response is always in terms of unfairness. It is unfair that, we are at a place where we do not, telecommunication providers do not get some sort of support, financial support, in order to be able to build infrastructure.
Well, I think the unfairness that they point to is even more bizarre, because it's an unfairness where they say, we're rolling out this infrastructure. It requires quite a lot of investment, and the return on investment we're getting is quite certain in terms of happening, but it's slow and it's not great. And look at big tech; they're making a lot of money and it's quicker. Except that's comparing apples and pears. It's like comparing, the business model of a car manufacturer and people building highways. Yes, they have different returns of investment. Is it fair? I have no clue if it's fair. It's just a different job you're doing. And so that's more the unfairness. Like, we need money, they have money. Isn't it unfair that they're not giving the money? Which, maybe it's unfair, but give me arguments on why they should give you that money. And that's where often it stays. And also, I think the use of fairness or unfairness is kind of convenient, because then you can the remedy to that unfairness is kind of a moving target in the conversations. When we started with fair share, everyone went, wait, are you saying sender party network pays? That whole thing? Didn't we discuss that 2 decades ago and we rejected it because it didn't make sense? And then, if there's enough pushback on one remedy, they go, no, that's not what we meant. Obviously, that's not what we meant, because that doesn't work. And then you go, wait, so is it the end of net neutrality? Are you saying discriminatory treatment of large content providers versus small content providers? Because I think we kind of regulated that one in Europe. And then they go, oh, of course, we're not touching net neutrality. There's no. And then afterwards you go, well, is it a fund? Is it a universal service fund? And people will contribute to it, and then it will be distributed according to the needs. And that, funnily, is the one that creates a lot of reaction with telcos, it seems, because then they know that they lose control on how the money gets spent. There will be money collected, but obviously it's not coming directly to them, and you have to bring a business case for it. And suddenly everyone goes, no, not a fund. So it's been interesting, because there is a problem that is not really defined. And when you ask them what's the solution, it's not really defined either in their answers, quite honestly, because it's been moving all the time. So basically, it's fairness. Something that is fair should be happening, and it should end up in the pocket of telecommunications operators. And the worrying part of this is it seems that it should only be fair to telecommunications operators. It doesn't need to be fair towards users or towards the internet as an architecture and as a phenomenon to a certain extent, because that's what the internet is. We don't care about fairness towards them. It needs to be fair towards the telcos. And that, I think, is the worrying part about this whole discussion. And from my interactions, is that it's built on false premises, a non-existent problem, and it has a very skewed framing. And I thought the best quote I ever saw on it was on LinkedIn from Chris Marsden, who's the academic that wrote one of the founding books on net neutrality. And he called it policy-based evidence making instead of evidence-based policy making. And that's what it feels like. It's like, we want to achieve something to please someone, so let's just invent what the reason is that we're doing it. And
if I just may interject, because I hear what you're saying, but if you said it, and I mentioned it in the beginning, that we sort of rejected this whole idea, right? Or something that looked like this idea 2 decades ago. Why do you think right now, again, it has become a thing, right? A policy thing, and we are dealing with it for the past year and a half?
Well, I think there's different things. I think there is a precedent that was set in the Copyright Directive, which is called the Press Publishers' Right, Article 15, where basically there was also a fairness argument about news articles being shared on social media platforms, and news publishers considering that they were not getting a fair return out of that sharing. And they obtained a mechanism, which is the Press Publishers' Right, that is supposed to alleviate that, although the jury is still out on the fact of it raising enough money to solve the problem that press publishers are facing. But obviously, press publishers and telecoms operators are not the same thing. In one case, you have stakeholders that are very important to democracy, to upholding democracy. It's a content business, whereas with telecoms operators, it's an infrastructure business, and they're super important as a critical infrastructure. So maybe they're indirectly important to democracy, I guess, but it's not the same thing. So that's one thing, the precedent. And it's actually mentioned in some Telefonica papers. They refer directly to the press publishers, right, as, hey, they got money, why aren't we getting money type of statement. There is also a fact that, in Brussels, most people don't really feel a lot of sympathy or empathy towards big tech. And that, why not use that? I think is one of the considerations. And in all honesty, I don't think in this debate you should feel sympathy for big tech. I think you should feel sympathy for users, and I think you should feel sympathy for the internet, because that's what's at stake. And as always, the risk you have when you try to impose something on big tech is that it actually strengthens their position at the end compared to smaller players, rather than weakening it. Because once you put big telcos and big tech in a room to do deals, God only knows what will happen out of that. So I'm not even sure that you're penalizing big tech that much. Yeah, so that's two things. And I'm not going to talk about the fact that there's a commissioner that used to be a CEO of a telecom operator at the moment in charge of this file. But obviously, maybe the stakeholders thought that there would be more sympathy coming from someone who understood telcos than from someone who doesn't. I don't know.
Well, thank you very much for this, Caroline. I think that it sort of paints a really good picture of where stakeholders in Europe are currently are thinking about this issue. Carl, I'm going to turn to you. Same question. What have we learned after a year and a half of this conversation? But I want you to share the position of the Internet Society. There is something, you guys have been looking at this issue from the infrastructure perspective and what the impact will be on the internet, the open, global, interoperable internet. So please, go ahead.
Thank you very much. And first, let me just say thank you for the invitation to the panel. And I think importantly for the organizers of this session, because I don't think we can get enough attention to this topic. And I can't really stress just how important we believe this topic to be, not only for internet users in Europe, but really globally. And I think we'll get into that later today on this panel about the repercussions and the reverberations of these discussions that we're having in Europe and how it's sort of spreading across the world. But from an Internet Society perspective, we see this as really going to the heart of our mission, which is about protecting and expanding a open and globally connected internet. And when we talk about the internet, we're literally talking about a network of networks, understood as independent networks voluntarily interconnecting to create something that is effectively greater than just the sum of their parts. And in this case, I think you can boil it down to connectivity from the local to the global level. So any policy discussion is really just generally across the board that is aimed towards regulating that connectivity. And I think in this case, effectively regulating it in the sense of conditioning connectivity will raise immediate alarms for us, not least because we've seen such efforts before, both in the case of South Korea, which I think we'll get into here with Professor Park, which I'm delighted that he was able to join, but also historically. I mean, I think Caroline alluded to this, that this is kind of a debate that seemingly pops up now and then. And, if you were working for a newspaper, you could probably prepare a headline that you can use every 5 to 10 years. And that would, I don't know exactly what it would be, but I think it goes to the effect that large telecom operators are asking governments to protect them from competition, because that's kind of at the heart of all of the things that we've seen across the years, where large telecom operators are not happy with the hand that they're sort of given in the world of the internet and the role that they have in the internet value chain. But if you look sort of concretely at the things being proposed under a fair share debate, what it's been uh, unfortunately, I think, named now fair share. Of course, the discussion is still going as to whether or not this is fair. I don't think we would say that this is about fairness in that sense. But what they're effectively asking governments to do is to sort of reinstate a different model of networking than what we have in the internet, and something more that is similar to the old telephone system of termination fees. So in the context of fair share, it's described as network usage fees. So effectively that internet traffic from a given source would be required to pay these network usage fees in order to have their traffic being delivered to the telco's customers. So now the reason why this is really a fundamental threat to the internet is because it goes against just how the internet architecture is designed and how it works, and the very essence of what it means to be on the internet. So on the internet, there's this very simple principle, if you will, that a network only really needs to interconnect with one other network that is already part of the internet, and that makes that internet part of the internet. And that might be a bit of a mouthful, but you can think about it as the simple principle where on the internet you only need to negotiate connectivity with one network, and you get connectivity to all networks. Very simple principle that is suddenly being challenged by the very idea of network usage fees. So what it would do is that network usage fees would effectively throw out this amazing feature that we have in the internet, and that's been really key to growing the internet globally, enabling new innovations to come online, etc. And instead, you would kind of condition connectivity and reachability on the internet on negotiating these network usage fees. So for me as a user, I wouldn't be guaranteed necessarily to reach all parts of the internet, but suddenly I would get access to whatever services that might have negotiated with my access network. So the first casualty in such a world is, of course, the principle of net neutrality that many have raised, where the existing rules around net neutrality prohibits telecom operators from discriminating between traffic sources. But in a world of network usage fees, they're effectively given the mandate to discriminate. But this kind of bigger picture also plays in where you would throw out very basic fundamental principles around how the internet works, and you would replace it with a very complex communications infrastructure instead, that is sort of premised on this idea of contracting across the whole network. So when we're looking at this, we can kind of, if you were to break it down, the big risk here in one sentence, it would be internet fragmentation. Because as a user, as I mentioned, you would need to ask yourself, when I'm getting an access service, am I getting access to all of the internet or parts of the internet? And as we see this policy discussion sort of spreading across the world, I think in the long run, you would need to ask yourself, do I actually get access to all of the internet? Do I get access to all of the geographical regions that are currently connected to the internet? Or will there be limitations due to these types of fees? But that's kind of like the principal statement as to why we're concerned about the fair share debate that we see it now, and the kind of the key proposals that we've seen, notably in that around network usage fees. But I think we're also concerned a bit to what Caroline was mentioning around how this policy process is playing out, where bad policy idea comes and go, and you can often refute them with evidence and reason. But I think what we've seen in Europe is really a kind of a concerted campaign, not only in Europe but also globally, where very sort of fundamental facts in the debate gets misrepresented, whether we're talking about who's actually generating the traffic. But also, I think the key part here, is there even a problem that requires a solution? And I think what's worrying in the European context is that even when regulators, like the body of European regulators, goes out and say, we don't actually see a problem here that warrants an intervention, you're still seeing this being pushed from the Commission, and the kind of the viewpoint of the large telcos is the one that is seemingly being pushed from the Commission, not least when you're looking at the consultation that we had, where there was no real description of what problem that we were supposed to evaluate these solutions against. It was just put in front of us and asking us if there are good or bad ideas, and also describing this as being an issue of large online services, quote unquote, generating traffic. And that really sort of fosters an unhealthy policy debate, I think, where it sort of brings even greater need for stakeholders to be involved in this, because it's not simply a matter of informing what's in good and bad policy, but it's really a political debate that needs to be mitigated as well.
Yeah, and I think what you were saying goes really back to this whole idea of evidence-based, right, policymaking, and especially when it comes to the impact or the potential impact that this could have on the open internet. There is not a lot conversation about this and a lot of discussion, and also there is no, as far as I can tell, and please jump in to correct me here, Carl. There is not a lot of consideration, at least in the context of the public consultation. We saw questions about network neutrality. We saw questions about, those very hot topics. But there was really not a question about what will actually this thing could do to the open internet. And from what you have, from what you said, there is really almost a certainty that should this policy proposal go forward, we will see a breaking down of the internet. First, fragmentation. This is a very big word, and I know that everybody's using it. But here, for my understanding from what you said, is that actually users might not be exposed to the content that they should be exposed, if this measure goes through. But you also mentioned that there's going to be a material change to the way interconnection happens, right? Because currently, as you were saying, you just, a network interconnects with the other network. Can you explain a little bit how, for those who are listening to us, how do two networks interconnect, and what will change should the fair share proposal, the network fees proposal, better yet, go through?
Yeah, sure. So just on the first point there around the kind of presenting a view of what this means for the internet, I think that is, as you say, it's been sort of missing from the discussions, and I'm really glad, that it's not only the Internet Society that's bringing forward this point. Many organizations are really calling this out as a big threat, that it is an internet architecture here that gets impacted. And I think for those that haven't seen, for instance, the Internet Architectural Board even contributed to the consultation, making this point that these types of rules would be a interference with the internet model of networking and would be putting at risk this type of internet fragmentation. But if you look at sort of the impact on the internet infrastructure, obviously it depends a little bit on what kind of flavor of these fair share rules that we would see. But at the very basic term, what I mentioned just before is that you would have this sort of conditioning of connectivity based on contracts that you don't really have in the internet today. But if you're looking at it also from an interconnection point of view, so just how the networks on the internet connect with each other in order to exchange traffic, today that is based on a voluntary model where you basically have two possible relationships. One is where you have a peering relationship where the networks are only exchanging traffics between the customers in each network, and that's how far the traffic goes. And then you also have another relationship where you interconnect with another network to get transit to all of the other networks. So you interconnect to one network that gives you access to all of the other networks out there. And one of the big problems with these fair share proposals that we've seen, and they come in different versions, as I mentioned, but we saw this in South Korea, for instance, is that it disincentivizes interconnections. It disincentivizes peering, notably amongst networks. So there is no real incentive to interconnect your networks if you're forced to negotiate that under a particular payment schema, as we saw in South Korea, for instance. And instead, you choose to not interconnect where it would be the most efficient in the network and exchange traffic where it's more efficient to exchange that traffic, but rather other considerations comes into place. So in South Korea, for instance, one of the consequences was that you saw a lot of content providers moving out from South Korea, choosing not to exchange traffic in South Korea, but rather do it at exchanges in Japan and Hong Kong, for instance, because they would not be put under this particular settlement regime in South Korea. So it kind of distorts the voluntary interconnection model that we have today, and sort of disincentivizes networks to interconnect where it's most efficient, and rather you're adding in another criteria that sort of does not allow for the most efficient interconnection pattern, but rather what becomes most sort of feasible given the settlement regime of payments. And that can have big implications for instance, the resilience of the internet, because the internet becomes more resilient when you have multiple interconnections and when you have a sort of a strong mesh of the networking.
Thanks, Carl. And of course, in all that, I think that both you, both yourself and Caroline alluded to that we need to think of consumers, and not everyone is thinking of consumers. Marco, I'll turn to you. The European Consumer Organization, in one of its comments that it made on this fair share proposal, it was early on, said, and I quote, for consumers in particular, the risks or potential disadvantages should range from a potential distortion of competition on the telecom market to the potential impacts on network neutrality, which could undermine the open and free access to the internet as consumers know it today. You're the head of litigation at Euroconsumers, and of course, you spend most of your day and time thinking of those issues. How have you been thinking of the network fees proposal, and what do you think the real impacts will be on consumers?
Let me say that we should all be grateful in a certain way for this consultation on fair share, because as you mentioned at the beginning, this is a kind of a tremendous time machine, which gives us back more or less 10 years of our lives. So I'm 36 again, I'm not 47, and I'm back in 2012. And the big telco companies are asking the Commission to oblige the big digital service providers to bear some of the costs of the Europe's telecom network. What happened between 2012 and 2022-23? I think, and I totally agree with Caroline, that it happened the copyright directive in 2019. The first seed of this proposal is inside, indeed, the copyright directive with the Article 15. And I believe that is not a case, that is not by chance that the content industry is now against this fair share proposal. Because on one hand, for sure, this can have an impact on the way the contents are widespread, and this is one point. But the other point is also to try to avoid any kind of abuse of a measure that maybe can be reused in the future. So to put it bluntly, if you take the money from a certain piece of the industry once, and then you take it twice, maybe the third time the money won't be there anymore. And the third time can be the Artificial Intelligence Act, for example. But the other point that I would like to stress, and that we also put forward in our document, the document that we submitted to the consultation, is that both in 2012 and 2022, the arguments pushed forward to support this kind of proposal on fair share, they relied on a set of inaccurate and wrong assumptions. So what we tried to do with our document was try to create a kind of debunking of these arguments. So I would like to focus on 3 points in my intervention. The first one is the fact that there is no clear evidence of an investment gap for the development of the new ultra-fast networks in the European Union. This is the main argument of the operator. So this is the investment gap. Someone has to pay for the development of the new networks, and those who provide content and services, they have to participate in this kind of development. By chance, on July of this year, there was this report published by WIT Consult that stated basically what we already stated in our document, so that there is no investment gap, so there is no clear evidence of this. The study does not mention any funding gap or shortage, only showing the total investment requirement. And one thing that I think it's pretty important is that they stated in this report that a yearly investment of 19.5 billion euros by major telco companies would be enough to achieve the goals for 2020 and 30 for connectivity in 2030. So if we consider just, for example, these numbers, we can see one first point is that this is already 100 billion euros less than what the telco claims as the so-called gap. But for a moment, let's consider that they are right. So the amount that they are claiming is right. So it's 200 billion euros so over 7 years. This might seem a lot, but if we look again at the number, then we can see that the European telecommunications sector spends more or less 50 or 60 billion euros annually on the capital expenditure. So basically, where is this gap? It seems to us, as Euro consumers, that indeed the major telecommunication companies, they aren't seeking for a fair contribution. They want their networks to be fully subsidized by big tech with an annual profit of at least €500 million if you consider these numbers. The second point, and I think it was mentioned in the previous intervention, it is related to the increase in data traffic. This is the other point that the telecommunication companies also claims due to the increase of the services and provided by the big tech, there is an increase in data traffic, and this data traffic generates higher cost for the network. And of course, because of this higher cost, the telco companies have less money to invest in the development of the digital infrastructure, and so to meet the targets for 2030. That's why they ask for a fair share. So they ask for a contribution to fill this investment gap. So you basically are those who are generating this increase of traffic. You have to pay for the investment that we cannot do because of this increase of traffic. The first point is that this increase of traffic is because of the consumers, not because of the content application provider. So the consumer asks for specific services, not the other way around. The other point which for us is pretty relevant is that if you go through the preliminary opinion of the BEREC on this proposal, this is another point that is pretty debunked in the preliminary opinion of the BEREC, because the cost of an EP network is not very traffic sensitive, and quoting BEREC, existing capacity can be utilized up to a certain point without additional cost, and only when higher peak of capacity is required, investment in network expansion are necessary. End of quoting for the BEREC. But in any case, even if we are living in a moment of peak, the upgrades and the cost for the upgrades are usually very low compared to the total network cost and come with a substantial increase in capacity. So also these are other arguments seems to fail a little bit. The third point, which I think it's pretty relevant in our case, is to consider the ecosystem in general, because this is a point very important when it comes to regulation. We don't see an evidence again of a market failure that justify this regulatory measure to intervene in this market. What we see indeed is that in the past decades, the increase in consumers' demand for digital products and services has generated great benefits for all the players involved in the market, not only for the content application providers, but also for the telco. Because of course, if you ask for certain kind of services, take a look, for example, at Netflix, Prime Video, and so on, you also need for a better internet connection. So you create a specific demand for broadband access, and this generated incomes also for the big telco company. So not only for the big tech, but also for the big telco company. So this system is based on a kind of virtual circle of mutual interdependence. If you touch a point, you run the risk to create a problem to the entire ecosystem. And we must remember that this internet ecosystem in the past decades has provided quality services at a reasonable price, which is something that is vital for consumers. So it's important to maintain this environment of competition and innovation, and measures like this could be not only counterproductive, but also completely unjustified. And the one of the most important, and this is my last point on this, we don't know what the consequences can be of these regulatory choices, because it's so vague in this moment, the way the proposal is drafted, that we don't see what can be potentially the impact, for example, on the net neutrality. What happens, for example, if a content provider decided not to pay at a certain moment, or to pay not the exact amount that is expected to pay? What happened to those content? They are blocked, they are degraded. We simply don't know in this moment. And this is a point which is pretty relevant. And without clarifying this point, I think that consumers must be really worried about this kind of proposal.
Thank you, Marco. So I think that there are a couple of points that I would like to extract from your intervention. The first one being that the term that currently is being used for this conversation, which is large traffic generators, to identify services offered by big technology companies, is mistaken, because, as you said, traffic is generated by users/consumers, right? They request the services that they want to access, and on that basis, those services become quite popular. And the second, perhaps very important point from the consumer perspective is that should a network fee is imposed in any fashion, then we might be talking, because again, we don't have it, so we cannot be sure about this, but all things point to the fact that there will be an increase in prices, there will be the quality will degrade, and consumers, the internet experience of consumers will materially change. Before I go to Professor Park, because as we've mentioned, in South Korea, the model or some version of it has been implemented for quite some time now, and there is a lot of conversation about this. As a small note, for those of you who are watching online, please know that you can put your questions where, if you have any. Of course, I believe that you can do so via YouTube or even LinkedIn. So please do ask questions, and I'll make sure that those get asked. So back to you, Professor Park, and thank you so very much for staying up way too late in Seoul right now to talk to us. But South Korea is the only jurisdiction currently that has implemented in some fashion the sending party network pays model, and it has created and caused a lot of issues. Can you please walk us through a little bit, A, on what the legislative framework currently is in South Korea regarding network fees, and B, also what sort of lessons you have learned from the imposition of this law?
Right now, thank you for organizing this. Right now, the law requires only ISPs, not content providers or any other end user of the network, but only ISPs to pay one another if you are the net sender of traffic. Now, it's a simple rule. If you are burdening the network by sending information out, then you should pay the receiving ISP. But that caused a lot of, and it's like, butterfly in Beijing causing typhoon. The butterfly effect has been huge. So, I mean, even even from that, you can already guess what's happening at. What does it mean? Send the data, right? Sending data means you are speaking online. Now, the more you are speaking, and the more you are sending data, the more you have to pay. It becomes tax on online speech. Now, I'll show you how that has really resulted in taxation on online speech. So ISPs, and because this rule was imposed only on ISPs, when they passed the law, they didn't even consult with the content providers. But the impact propagates through the market. So ISPs hosting popular contents. Actually, let me show you this. Let me show you. Okay, probably you can see that now. Oh, okay,
Yes,
there you go. Okay, good. So you see 3 networks. Each network disappeared.
Okay. We can still see it, Keith.
Okay, each network governed by one ISP, ISP1, ISP2, ISP3. And as you can see on ISP2's network, Naver, which is #1 content provider in Korea, is hosted. Now ISP2 now people on ISP1's network and people on ISP3's network, they'll also want to access Naver, the green the green square on ISP2's network. They don't want the contents from ISP2's network as well. So ISP2 becomes the net sender of the data. So now ISP2 has to pay ISP1 and ISP3. Think about what does to the incentive for ISPs in hosting popular contents. They don't want to host anymore because the more they host, they have to pay other ISPs. So it creates disincentives against hosting contents, which means ISPs can now raise the prices of transit. So this is what happens.
And have you seen this? Have you experienced this in the context of South Korea? An increase in prices?
Sure. Okay. So now I don't know how to change the. Okay, remove from stage. This has increased the transit prices that ISPs can charge to the content providers, and it has increased, according to telegeography, to 8 times Paris, 10 times Frankfurt, 9 times London, 5-6 times Los Angeles and New York. And you can see under what economic condition the content providers in Korea are surviving. You'll see that some of the top content providers are paying lion's share of their revenues as internet access fees. Watcha is kind of Korea's own Netflix. It's a video streaming service. In 2021, they paid 10% of their revenue as internet access fees. Africa TV, which is kind of a TikTok of Korea, they paid in 2017, they paid all their profits as internet access fees. And in 2020, COVID location tracking app, which is really a public interest app. The operator complained about not being able to fully operationalize the app because of the high internet access fees. And local video services, they are dropping out of competition against YouTube because of high internet access fees. And because of this, since Naver and Kakao, which is another dominant content provider in Korea, we haven't seen any unicorn among startups. Now, also small ISPs are being cannibalized by big ISPs because of high transit fees. Now, as Carl already mentioned, overseas content providers, they are refusing to connect directly with Korean ISPs because now this needs a little bit of explanation. If they directly connect with Korean ISPs, that means they go into the Korean ISP's data center, they go on that ISP's network, then that ISP now has to pay a lot of money to other ISPs. So now the Korean ISPs that used to host overseas content providers, now they want to charge money or charge more money. So the overseas content providers, cannot afford that. So they are routing the traffic in more latency-ridden routes. And think about, what will happen to the content industry. For instance, Netflix invests a lot in Korea dramas and movies. They are all like, Korea eyeball heavy contents. But the more Korea eyeball heavy contents they carry, they'll be now asked to pay because of this incentive system that's happening among ISPs. They'll be asked to pay basically peering fees to Korean telcos. So they'll have to reduce the investment in the contents that are popular among Korean eyeballs. And that's exactly what happened with the Twitch. Twitch, the game broadcasting platform, they intentionally, they didn't completely cut out of Korea, but they intentionally degraded services in Korea. So that's what's happening. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Professor Park. And, funny enough, in doing a little bit of research about today's conversation, I saw that, and we need to say that there was an ongoing lawsuit between Netflix and South Korean internet service provider, SK Broadband. And yesterday, and please confirm if this is not the case, but apparently they announced in a joint statement that they had agreed on a partnership and to release joint projects and seek ways to use artificial intelligence products being developed by SK Broadband, and that all the lawsuits have been dropped. So we're actually seeing that, collaboration, which I think is the underlying tone of everyone's intervention so far, is the way forward, instead of actually having one party or some networks, the access networks in our case, being perhaps considered as more important than other networks. But Korea does provide a cautionary tale, and you would think that the lessons that have learned there, and I know that you, Professor Park, and also OpenNet, the civil society organization that you're affiliated with, have been very vocal about those lessons, would just land in other jurisdictions. Yet, this is not really the case. And I'll turn to you now, Smitri. And again, thank you very much for joining so late from India, because India is currently having this conversation. Is that right?
Yep. Thank you so much for having me here, and thank you to the Information Labs team for inviting me. It is right, and before talking a little bit about what's happening in India right now, I just wanted to spend a few moments with a little bit of backstory, because I'm not sure how many people in the audience have really followed the net neutrality story in India. And it's interesting for the current debate for a couple of reasons, mainly because if you see the arguments coming from the operators, the telecom service providers, the usual arguments given is that if you don't allow such arrangements, if you don't allow some kind of preferential treatment, some kind of economic exchange, one, universal access is something that won't be possible. You will not have investments in infrastructure, and overall the quality of services will deteriorate. And India really presents an example of how, if you look at the timeline of how, when India adopted net neutrality, and if you look at the timeline from that period, which was around between 2016 to 2018 until today, the network landscape in India has completely changed in terms of from 300 million users, you have about 800 million plus internet users today. You have a leapfrog from 2G services to 4G services. So really that debunks that argument which says that unless you have such kind of arrangements, there won't be investment in infrastructure. The point is that if there is a business case, and if there are users coming online, and if there are players in the market who have strategies to bring users online, all of that will take place independent of whether or not you allow the cherry on top to be delivered to TSPs through these other kind of arrangements. So that's the backstory I wanted to share, that India is one of the countries which has one of the strongest net neutrality regimes, and is one of the countries where actually the restrictions on zero rating or differential treatment of pricing of data preceded the general net neutrality regulation on the banning discriminatory treatment of traffic. And all of that has happened between 2016 to 2018, and for most of us we thought that debate is kind of settled for now. But of course there is the Brussels policy effect, which has wiped off on India as well, and we've seen the reopening of this debate over the last year or so. And the interesting thing on why that has happened is that in India, actually, the debate on net neutrality has been really intrinsically tied with the debate on the regulation of what are called OTT, the over the top service providers. So basically apps and content providers which are riding on top of the public internet. And for years the telecom industry in India has been lobbying hard, saying that at least the communication OTT providers, services like WhatsApp, Signal, etc., they are providing services which is the equivalent of telecommunication services, and there needs to be some kind of regulation on them. And straight from 2015 we've been having this overlapping discussion. The net neutrality part of the argument was sorted in the way that I explained. The OTT part of it remained hanging for a while. But in 2020 our telecommunication regulator called the TRAI came up with recommendations to the government, saying that as things stand, there doesn't seem to be a case for specialized regulation for OTT services. Let the market evolve, let's do a wait and watch kind of policy. And it was settled from their point of view. But the government didn't really take that as a final answer, because obviously the telecom service providers have been in constant touch with the government. And after the opening of this question on fair share, in Europe there were reports of the telecom service association here going to the government and saying that we need to reopen and reconsider this discussion, and we need to have fair usage fees being paid to the telecom operators for the betterment of the infrastructure, etc. The same arguments that we heard in the European context. And that's what led to this current round of consultation, which has been opened by the telecommunication regulator, that because they received a reference from the government, they were compelled to start a new round of consultation, asking questions about how OTT service providers should be regulated. And as a part of that consultation, they've asked questions about whether there is need for a collaborative framework between OTT providers and telecom providers. So they haven't really proposed from the regulatory standpoint as of now, any kind of fair share. But of course, the responses that have come from the telecom industry to this consultation talk about the need for, sharing the burden for infrastructure expansion, for sharing kind of equivalent or similar responsibility on OTT players. They also kind of make this sweet for the government by bringing this foreign versus national point of view. So the fact that all of the telecom service providers are domestic entities, they're regulated by domestic laws, but large content providers are not. They're usually foreign entities, and this question about they are not being taxed here, and therefore the government is not getting any part of the revenue. But if the telecom operators were to get a part of this revenue from them, then as a licensed entity, as an entity which pays licensing fees to the government, even the government indirectly kind of benefits. So these are the kind of arguments we are seeing from telecom operators. Of course, there's a strong pushback from civil society. There was a pushback back in 2015-16 when the net neutrality came about. The same groups, the same individuals have rallied together. There is a strong pushback both from individuals and civil society, and of course the strong content providers lobby as well is pushing back on these rules. As of now, we don't know. The consultation process has just closed. The counter comments process is still open, so it's till the end of this month that the comments will keep coming in. After that, the regulator will sit on this for a while and come up with a decision, which again will be just recommendations at this point of time, because the division of regulatory responsibilities in India is such that the telecom regulator will not rule on these issues. They can make recommendations to the government, and the government retains the regulatory power to choose to decide whether or not to take certain actual actions on this.
Thank you so much, Smitri. I mean, it's really fascinating, especially considering the fact that India has been trying for the past couple of years to position itself as a hub for innovation and and try to attract talent. It's quite surprising that there is this consultation that will have the effects that we'll have on the internet, as we heard from Carl. Luca, I'm going to turn to you. Thank you so very much for patiently waiting and for joining us too early. I understand that you're in New York. You're in Brazil. You've been following what's been happening. You've been following network neutrality for much earlier than I have, for sure. There is a TEDx talk as well on the topic. Can you please tell us what is happening in Brazil, whether the Brussels effect has actually, the same way that it has affected India, has affected Brazil? And also, why do you think this is or is not an issue of network neutrality?
Thank you very much, Konstantinos, and thank you very much to the Friends of the Information Lab for organizing this excellent conversation. Just for our audience, I wanted to clarify that I don't have the gift of ubiquity yet. So I'm currently in this moment in New York, but usually I am based in Brazil, so that the solution of the riddle of Konstantinos' introduction. Now to less trivial things, let's try to understand a little bit how this debate on fair share is emerging in Brazil and what is the context there. Well, first of all, you might recall that Brazil has adopted already net neutrality legislation in 2014 with the Marco Civil Internet that was created with a strong push from society. The center I lead, the Center for Technology and Society, had a key role in organizing the consultation, and the result was really a law that had a lot of democratic support in it. Why net neutrality is particularly relevant, and what is the context of the fair share in Brazil? Well, let me also add as a little bit of context that it is true that in Brazil there is a very dominant position of certain platforms. You may see, for instance, there are recent studies that show that platforms of the Meta group like WhatsApp, Facebook, and Instagram, they respectively are present in 95, 85, and 70% of Brazilians' smartphone. If you want to, if you're a customer, a user, an individual user, and you want to share a video, the recordings will be likely hosted and then streamed by YouTube. But the current debate on fair share does literally nothing to solve these problems. So in the past weeks, a couple of months ago, Anatel, the Brazilian telecoms regulator, started a consultation basically to ask, amongst other things, whether it should adopt specific rules to frame the behavior of a certain applications provider that are responsible for large portions of the internet access traffic. So although it was not used the label fair share, and it was not said explicitly, and it was not specifically consultation on fair share, the allusion was quite evident. And also, let me clarify that Anatel, as a telecoms regulator, does not have exactly a mandate to regulate the behavior of applications provider that are categorized by the Brazilian law as, by the Marco Civil as application provider, not internet access provider, and by the General Telecommunications Law as value-added services, not telecom services. So, applying the law strictly, Anatel could not be interested in how to regulate these providers, but the angle that Anatel is using is that actually these providers supposedly do not use correctly, in an adequate way, internet connectivity. And so Anatel has, according to Article 4 of the General Telecommunications Law, the authority to regulate how users use telecommunication services in an appropriate manner, right? And here we enter into why all this debate on fair share at the Brazilian level, but the same rationale applies in pretty much all the global South and many global North countries. Why this debate does really literally nothing to correct the distortion that we may see in the market in terms of dominance of certain platforms. First, the fact that platforms generate a lot of traffic is not due to any illegal or inappropriate behavior or practice of platforms. It's due to the fact that they have a lot of customers, which is not yet considered illegal by any standards. So it is incorrect. It's a fallacy to argue they behave inappropriately and they should be regulated, because they simply provide the service. Secondly, the fact it is also quite incorrect. And again, I'm saying this not because I have any particular sympathy for big platforms, but simply because I've been spending the past decade and a half studying this phenomenon. So it's also good to contextualize a little bit. And it is inappropriate, very inappropriate, to argue that large platforms are free riders of telecom infrastructure, because they actually invest a lot in digital infrastructures, be it through submarine cables, be it through content delivery networks, but they put billions, really, literally, in investments. So it is not correct that to say that they free ride on internet access networks. And third, and to me this is the most important consideration, and the reason why there is a huge overlap between the fair share and net neutrality discussion. The main reason why social media platforms in particular have become so dominant in the global South and Brazil specifically is because they have been zero rated for 10 years. It is not a surprise if you give for free social media platforms and few other apps, and all the rest of the internet remains inaffordable or extremely expensive. Maybe it is around 10% of the minimum wage in Brazil, and 70% of the population earns the minimum wage. So it's not a surprise that 70% of the population, at least between 70 and 80% of the Brazilian population, uses zero rating models. And it is not a surprise that the fact that for 10 years, a large portion, an enormous portion of the population has been using these models has produced, as a consequence, the fact that these platforms generate an enormous amount of traffic. Let me also remind that this is not only a global South problem. Until one of the main advocates of fair share that you were mentioning before, Deutsche Telekom, until 2 years ago had a model called binge on, because customers could really literally binge on any video they could wish. So again, it is not by any divine law or law of physics that zero rating exists, and users have been pushed into consuming the more video or social media content with high definition images as possible. It has been an explicit choice of the very same operators that now are trying to lobby for these fair share proposals. And also, let me stress another point, because it may not be the same in all the countries, but in Brazil, large internet access providers are not in need of investments. They actually, only yesterday, Vivo, the subsidiary of Telefonica, announced is going to redistribute 5 billion reais, which is $1 billion, to shareholders. Claro increased revenues by 10.8% this year. So we are not speaking about corporations that are broke and badly need investments. We are speaking about corporations that obviously they want to earn more, because it's their natural behavior to earn more. And as publicly traded corporation, every trimester they have to show to shareholders they are earning more. Again, it's their business model. But that as the solution, so-called solution that is proposed, does literally nothing to solve the problem of reducing market dominance of certain large platforms. On the contrary, it would simply maintain the market dominance, because the same zero rating models will not be impacted, but would shift some of the revenue of these platforms to telecom providers and their shareholders. So actually, if Anatel or any other Brazilian regulator is interested in solving this enigma, they should simply apply Article 9 of Marco Civil da Internet and Article 9 of the regulation that prohibits on one hand, the Marco Civil to engage in discriminatory traffic management, and on the other hand, the regulation to give preferential treatment to any platform for commercial reasons. So, and again, also let me stress that the only reason why these zero rating models are considered as compatible with net neutrality in Brazil is because CADE, the antitrust regulator CADE, under the consultancy and very assertive advice of Anatel, the telecoms regulator, stated in 2017 with a specific regulation that zero rating does not create any evidence of market failure. It does not create any evidence of dominance of any specific actor. And so in 2017, this practice of zero rating, they were considered compatible with net neutrality. Now, I see the evidence that the regulators were looking for in 2017 as quite evident and obvious in being the very same reason of the consultation that Anatel is organizing now. So the fact that actually these models, not any kind of cabal organized by large platform, for which, again, I stress, I do not nourish any particular sympathy, but it is not their fault if they have become such dominant in internet access, in internet traffic terms. It is a direct result of 10 years of zero rating.
Thank you very much, Luca. And of course, I think that it also goes a little bit back to Caroline's analogy in the beginning, right? I mean, some companies in the internet, they scale because the internet allows them to scale, right? This is the global internet, so you can scale because you're operating on a global network. I don't believe we have any questions from the audience, and we have 15 to 16 minutes left. So I will ask one question, and then I would just like you, to anyone who's willing to really take this question. And then really, I would like to ask you for 1 to 2 minutes closing remarks. But Luca was talking about free riding and was talking about the complexity of infrastructure, and absolutely, the internet infrastructure is indeed very complex. We heard the same thing from Carl. However, there seems to be some sort of connectivity issues, right? That various countries, challenges, better yet, that various countries are facing. I was, for instance, back home, which is Greece for me, last month, and I live on an island, and frankly, our connectivity in a significant part of the island is not coming from the Greek telecommunications provider, but it's coming from the Turkish telecommunications provider, because we are so close. So obviously, for some remote areas, there are some underserved areas, there are connectivity issues, and they would help from infrastructure investment. So, because I would really like to end with a hopefully positive note and a way forward, because this debate is also very polarized, as we all know. As you make your closing comments, I would like you to think, what is the way forward here? Because as we all have said, this thing pops up every now and then. And I fear that, again, if it gets killed or if it doesn't get killed, but there is no really collaboration or resolution, then in 5 years, most probably InfoLabs will inviting us for another one of those online conversations. So let me start now, going back. I would start with Professor Park, because I really want you to go to bed, and thank you again, once again, for staying up so late. What would be, let's say that you all have a magic wand. What do you think would be the one thing that we can do in order to move this debate forward? Professor Park, I believe you're on mute still, so. Now we should be able to hear you.
All right.
Yes, thank you.
Now you can see the diagram, right? I think
no. Now we are about to see it. Yes, we can.
Okay, do you see
Thank
now?
you so much.
Yes. I think one thing that, how the internet kind of makes data delivery almost free for everybody. We keep talking about how the network maintenance cost is not sensitive to traffic, but I was a physics major in college, and I think a lot of people just don't understand why it really costs. People don't really understand the science behind how the internet revolutionized communication or communicative experience that the humanity is enjoying. What people don't understand is that when data propagates through the medium, it really costs nothing. The same way that when you receive like high resolution video through your free to air TV, or even through your cable TV, it's not like you pay more if you watch more TV, right? The same thing, like even now you are looking at a computer screen right now, or just look at the tree outside. It's morning, afternoon, right? Where you are. Very high resolution video is coming through into your eyes right now, and there's really no cost involved. Now, as long as all these network participants are not trying to charge one another, because I scratch your back, you scratch mine, you deliver my data, I deliver yours. As long as we keep within the, we comply with this great promise that made the information revolution possible, there is really no reason that we should be worried about when we say, certain participants' traffic is taking 40%, 50% of all the traffic. On the diagram on the right side, you see the graph. It shows how the network traffic has increased by 5 times, but the network maintenance cost, the green bar, has really remained the same. So the fact that some platforms are mediating, lion's share of global traffic doesn't mean that they have to pay more. Now, it is if we why not? I mean, they have a lot of money. Why not charge them? Well, if we charge them, the burden will be passed on to all these little people who are making living off of the big platforms. So the future, I think, is education.
Thank you for this, Smitri.
Thanks. So I'm not sure if I share the optimism of is there this golden solution that can be achieved, because I think till these power centers remain that dynamic, that power tussle will go on. But at least from the Indian context, a few trends which are emerging is one. We are seeing arrangements where telecom service providers are getting investments. So the largest telecom provider in India is called Reliance Jio. It's got investments from Facebook, it's got investments from Google. So there are actually these backhand sweetheart deals which will happen, and maybe that will at some point hit a sweet spot that they will feel that we don't need to protest under this route because we are getting what we need under other routes. So far, despite the investments, clearly it hasn't hit that spot, but that's one possibility, that they work out other kind of commercial arrangements outside of the domain of commercial arrangements for traffic exchange. The other part of it in the Indian context is that the government certainly wants a share of the pie. So it's not just that the telecom providers want this. There is this clear, strong feeling that the OTT players are not being adequately regulated, and we want to do something about them. That revenue somehow needs to come into the government's hand, and till that is somehow settled, either through regulation, which unfortunately will be some sort of excessive regulation, but till that is somehow settled, I don't think that's a solution. One long-term solution, which again requires policy intervention, is for the government to soften its hand on telecom operators, because again, in the Indian context, we have one of the most expensive spectrum allocations in the world. So you do feel for the telecom operators. It's a market which runs entirely 78-79% of the internet access in India is wireless, and they're relying on spectrum, and it's very, very expensive spectrum. So unless there is rationalization at that end, I don't think these demands will stop from the TSPs.
Thank you, Smitri. Luca, I'll get to you now, and we actually have one question on YouTube, and I am reading it the way it was written, so you and I will need to decipher a little bit. But greetings. I'd like to ask about the effect of fragmentation and zero rating in the digital innovation on internet, especially for the global South. So I guess that what the question is asking is how zero rating has really affected innovation in the global South, and especially since you have the experience in Brazil, and also the effect that it might have had on internet fragmentation. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for this question, because it, again, is one of the multiple issues we have raised today that make me feel much younger, because I wrote a paper about this in 2016, and it was very much then in line of what the European Court of Justice stated in the Telenor case in 2020, which is, of course, the fact that you have zero rating models can present more harm for users if the telecom operator or internet access provider that deploys this kind of business models is particularly large and has dominant market power. But what will happen if virtually any kind of internet access provider utilizes zero-rating models is that automatically the attention of the user, it is steered toward what it is free, supposedly free, of course, because it is paid with personal data, not with money, and concentrate attention towards only a specific cluster of applications, while the rest remains very expensive. Now, what is the obvious consequence of this? And then we also have to think in practical terms. The people that are most likely to utilize these kinds of models, although they are widespread in virtually any kind of plan in the global south, but those who are more likely to utilize them are the less wealthy people, which in Brazil, again, statistically, it's about 85% of the population that utilize zero-rating models, and corresponds precisely at the so-called class C, D, and E. So in Brazil, the Brazilian Institute for Statistics classifies by rent households, and so you have class A, B, C, D, E, and B and C, D, E are those who utilize the most this kind of models. And what does it mean? That they do not have access to the internet. They have access to a very narrow set of applications. And actually, it's a new type of poverty, because there is a very good study by the IDEC, the Brazilian Institute for Consumer Protection, of November 2021, 2021, that showed precisely that after the second or third week of the month, most of Brazilian users only use social media, because they've ended their monthly data allowance. So it's a new type of poverty. You have people that at the third week of the month can only have social media, and that is also very difficult to match with Marcos Villa Internet, whose Article 7 prescribes that internet access is instrumental for the full enjoyment of citizenship in Brazil, right? Because you actually you have evidence that 80% of the population is not really a complete citizen, is a pariah, as Indians would say. And actually, to come back to the Indian example of what actually may result in prohibiting this kind of models, because India is the only global south country that prohibited zero-rating in 2016 with the net neutrality regulation. And since then, there has been an explosion of innovation in India. India is the only country, together with China and the US, that exports innovation, large tech corporations. Why? Because they have an enormous market. They have had an enormous market. I mean, the Indians have prohibited zero-rating. I mean, at the time, a lot of people were cheering for India for human rights and freedom of expression reasons. I don't want to underestimate the Indian government support for human rights, but it was obviously a sort of protectionist. It is called nowadays digital sovereignty. The fact that you actually protect your national digital environment to let your national startups thrive and become your national champions of the future, which is exactly what happened in India. India is experiencing since 2016 really literally a belle epoque of innovation, primarily due to the fact that users can choose whatever kind of innovation they want, and they are not steered into predefined applications that, of course, create fragmentation, because there is a free set of applications and a very expensive one. And as most of people in the world are poor, they will only use the free one.
Thank you so much, Luca. Carl, literally, we have 2 minutes. So please, briefly, what is your positive thinking message here? How do we move forward?
Well, I wasn't expecting to have to give a positive message going forward, but I think in terms of this sort of magical thinking and wishful thinking, I think what I would like to see is sort of the politics being taken out of some of the questions that are being discussed in the fair share debate. I think the issues around infrastructure investments are important. And I think especially to your point, Konstantinos, how do you ensure connectivity in underserved areas today. Like those should be front and center. How do we deal with competition amongst online services? That should be front and center, but we need to recognize that the current discussion that is being driven by large telcos isn't the answer to those questions. Instead, it's more likely to have these adverse effects for both of those goals. Like, for instance, what we haven't discussed today is what these rules would mean for smaller network operators. Like, it's quite apparent in the debate in Europe that it's really just the large telcos calling for this, while the smaller internet service providers are skeptical of this, and they see that this is likely to have adverse competitive effects for them vis-a-vis the large telcos. And of course, we know that smaller operators are those that are really beneficial in terms of connecting underserved areas. So all of these policy issues that are kind of adjacent or linked to this debate deserves a lot of attention. But in order for them to get the appropriate attention, you need to bring the politics out of this and approach it from the facts rather than the sort of the framings that have been perpetuating debate for now more than a year.
Thank you so much, Carl. Marco, very quickly, how do we solve this? How do we move forward?
I don't know how to solve it, but sometimes it seems that we have a solution in search of a problem. Because if you look at the data shows a different kind of reality. I would like to say that the money for the areas where there is a real market failure are available through the Next Generation EU or the funding of the European Union. For all the rest, I would like to quote the letter that recently in Italy, our Undersecretary of State for Digital Transition sent to Commissioner Thierry Breton, taking a very clear position against this proposal, saying basically, we don't see this investment gap, the money is there. So I think this describes the situation.
Thanks, Marco. And last but not least, Caroline, after all this, where do we go?
I mean, I don't have a solution because, as Marco said, I'm not sure there is a problem. And if there is a problem, I don't think it's the same one in each member state, because telecom operators have very different issues in their countries. But I think we just need to make telecom operators feel sexy and wanted, make them feel they're the Netflixes and the Googles, because I think part of what they dislike in their current role is that, sadly, they're a commodity. But we should tell them they're a very important commodity and that we value what they're bringing to our homes.
And with that note, I would like to thank you all very, very much. I would like to thank you for being up late, for waking up early, for contributing to this conversation, for speaking your minds. Thank you all very much. And I'll see you online and hopefully someplace else. Have a good one. Bye-bye.
Thank you.